Throughout most of the history of philosophy, a strong distinction has been acknowledged between the mental and the physical. Many philosophers, notably Rene Descartes, thought it simply obvious that the mind was not anything like matter. Moreover, most of the religions of the world reinforced this idea by insisting that human beings are essentially immaterial or immortal souls capable of surviving the deaths of their bodies. Today, this idea is known as substance dualism, in reference to the two substances, mental and physical, which it entails. As J.P. Moreland and Scott B. Ray explain, at its root, dualism simply means twoism, and it expresses a commitment to the proposition that two items in question are in fact two different entities or kinds of entities instead of being identical to one another. But all of this began to change with the advent of modern science. Throughout the 20th century, the idea that human beings are purely physical entities became dominant and remains the majority view among philosophers right down to the present. However, there have been a recent series of publications challenging the viability of this physicalist picture of the world, instead insisting that there are sound reasons to believe in an immaterial mind after all. This series will review and defend several of these arguments for substance dualism and offer objections to the physicalism which currently prevails in academia. This will take us deep into the field of philosophy of mind. As this field is complex and can be intimidating to newcomers, this first video in the series will merely introduce viewers to the mind-body problem within philosophy of mind. We will explore the major contenders and concepts involved. My hope is that this will make the subsequent videos detailing the case for substance dualism more accessible to viewers. This is an introduction to the mind-body problem. There are broadly three positions one can take when it comes to the relationship between mind and matter. These are physicalism, dualism, and idealism. In the modern era, the most popular of these is physicalism, the thesis that the mind just is physical in some sense. As Jaegwon Kim triumphantly declares, no serious competitor to physicalism is visible on the horizon. Today, any proposed general ontology of the world, not just views about the mind-body relation, is defined by its relationship to materialism, the position that the world consists exclusively of bits of matter and structures made up of bits of matter, all behaving in accordance with physical law. Everything is an arrangement of matter, and living organisms and minded creatures are no exception. There are, of course, a variety of types of physicalism. Given just how many varieties there are, I am forced to be somewhat brief in my overview of them here. One historically important and currently prominent version of physicalism is known as identity theory. This theory seeks to identify the mind with the brain or with some part of it. As John Heil explains, proponents of the identity theory side with behaviorists against the Cartesian notion that minds are non-material substances, but stand with the Cartesians against the behaviorist contention that having a mind is nothing more than behaving or being disposed to behave in particular ways. Identity theorists argue that states of mind are genuine inner states of agents possessing them. These states, as neuroscience will someday reveal, are states of our brains. Mental states are identical with brain states. Mental states are states of brains. The identity theory appeals to anyone attracted to the idea that minds are just brains. Another physicalist theory of mind is known as behaviorism. Behaviorism identifies mental properties with certain behavioral properties of the human body. These behavioral properties can roughly be described as something like dispositions to act in particular ways in certain circumstances. Anthony Kenny explains, behaviorists maintain that when we attribute mental states or events to people, we are really making roundabout statements about their actual or hypothetical bodily behavior. Behaviorism attempts to reduce mentalistic items, such as belief and desire, to physical dispositions or bodily movement. Still another type of physicalism is called functionalism. According to functionalism, mental states are to be identified with the roles which they play within the body, as opposed to their composition or constitution. Again, John Heil says, Functionalists begin with a shared set of insights and convictions, then spin these out in different ways. Earlier, we saw that functionalism blossomed with the advent of computing machines. We distinguish programs and computations from the hardware said to realize these. And, functionalists contend, we can deploy the same distinction in explicating the mind. Think of minds as devices running software on complex chunks of hardware. In the case of human beings, the human brain. Just as computational operations are realized by processes in the hardware of a computing machine without being identical with those processes, so states of mind are realized by states of the brain without being identical with those states. All of these types of physicalism are characterized by their attempt to reduce the mental to something physical. Hence, they are classed within the family of theories known as reductive materialism. But not all physicalists want to reduce the mental to the physical. Some firmly believe that this cannot be done, for although the mind is not something distinct from the body or brain, it nevertheless cannot be described fully in terms of those things. This view is known as non-reductive materialism. Nancy Murphy is a representative of this perspective, and she explains it as follows. For dualists, the concept of the soul serves the purpose of explaining what we might call humans' higher capacities. These include a kind of rationality that goes beyond that of animals, as well as morality. A reductive view would say that if there is no soul, then people must not be truly rational, moral, or religious. That is, what was taken in the past to be rationality, morality, and spirituality is really nothing but brain processes. The non-reductive physicalist says instead that if there is no soul, then these higher human capacities must be explained in a different manner. In part, they are explainable as brain functions, but their full explanation requires attention to human social relations and to cultural factors. Still, other physicalists deny that the mental can be reduced to the physical, not because they think that mental items like thoughts and beliefs can't be analyzed in terms of physical items, but rather because they deny that such mental items exist in the first place. This position, known as eliminative materialism, is probably the most extreme form of physicalism. Paul Churchland advocates for this view, and he describes it this way. Eliminative materialism doubts that the correct neuroscientific account of human capacities will produce a neat reduction of our common sense framework. As the eliminative materialist sees it, the one-to-one matchups will not be found, and our common sense psychological framework will not enjoy an inner theoretic reduction because our common sense psychological framework is a false and radically misleading conception of the causes of human behavior and the nature of cognitive activity. On this view, folk psychology is not just an incomplete representation of our inner natures, it is an outright misrepresentation of our internal states and activities. Finally, there is supervenience materialism, which can be defined as the thesis that mental properties supervene upon particular physical states of affairs. As Edward Feser says, one thing supervenes on another just in case there could not be a difference in the first without there being a difference in the second. Materialism can accordingly be understood as the claim that all real objects, properties, and processes, including those of the mind, supervene on purely physical objects, properties, and processes. Nothing that happens, and in particular nothing mental can happen at all, unless something happens at the purely physical level, and ultimately at the level of the most fundamental entities postulated by physics. Unlike reductionism, this need not entail that the basic entities are, in some sense, all that really exist. It entails only that everything that happens at the level of tables, rocks, mines, etc., ultimately happens only because something happens at the level of fundamental particles. The extent to which supervenience materialism differs from several of the other theories which we have already canvassed is a matter of some controversy, but the complexities of that debate need not concern us here. Further distinctions and qualifications could certainly be given, and they would be necessary if this were intended to be a comprehensive overview of physicalist theories of mind. But in very broad strokes, these are the options open to physicalists: reductive materialism, non-reductive materialism, eliminative materialism, and supervenience materialism. They all have in common the idea that the human mind is fundamentally a physical thing. There is no immaterial soul or any other sort of spooky element to the human person. We are fully made of matter. This brief overview will suffice for our purposes in this series, since the distinctions between various types of physicalism will not concern us much. My intention is to argue against the central assumption inherent within all of them, namely that the mind is not a concrete particular distinct from the physical material which comprises the body. On the opposite side of the spectrum lies idealism. Whereas physicalism wants to deny that there is any immaterial component to the human person, idealism goes to the other extreme and denies that there is any material component at all, not only to human persons, but also to the universe. For idealists, there is no such thing as a mind-independent reality, because everything is fundamentally mental. As John Foster explains, idealism takes the physical world to be logically created by sensory organization, or by some rich complex of non-physical facts in which this organization centrally features. As such, it rejects both parts of the realist thesis. It takes the physical world to be something whose existence is logically dependent on facts about the human mind, and it holds that physical facts are, in all cases, constituted by non-physical facts. As with physicalism, there are several different varieties of idealism, but again, the distinctions between the various sorts of idealism will not concern us in this series. Both physicalism and idealism are types of monism. Monism is the belief that there is only one type of substance or property. For physicalists, that one substance is physical. For idealists, it is mental. Between these two extremes lies dualism. Dualism maintains that there is not one, but rather two types of substances, physical and mental. As John Foster explains, the dualist takes the mental and the physical realms to be ontologically separate. The dualist gives a radically non-physicalistic account of what exists or occurs within the mind. He takes sensations, thought episodes, decisions, instances of belief, and so on to be wholly non-physical, to be devoid of any intrinsic physical attributes or location in physical space. The dualist thus shares important commitments with both physicalism and with idealism. He accepts the reality of both a mind-independent physical world, as well as the reality of an immaterial mental world. As Charles Taliaferro says, midway between the extremes of radical idealism and the austere materialism just documented lies dualism. The dualist joins the idealist in recognizing a realm of conscious awareness, a realm which is not itself physical, and joins the materialist in recognizing a distinct realm of objects which are not the contents of consciousness. As such, dualism seems to represent a marriage between partners who are forever in tension. A dualist resists the allure of either account alone. As with physicalism and idealism, there are also various types of dualism. There is substance dualism and there is property dualism. Both believe that there is an immaterial element to the human person. The former sees the mind and body as two distinct substances, whereas the latter sees a single substance which possesses both material and immaterial properties. Of greater interest to us throughout this series will be substance dualism, as this is what I intend to defend. There are many types of substance dualism, but they all agree on a few central theses. Brandon Rickabaugh and J.P. Moreland define the minimal commitments of substance dualism as follows. Mere substance dualism. The human person, 1, is comprised of a soul, a fundamental immaterial or spiritual substance, and a physical body. 2, capable of existing without a body, but not without his or her soul. And 3, the mental life of which is possessed and unified by his or her soul. As will be made clear through many of the arguments which I will present later in this series, I am a Cartesian substance dualist. I believe in a radical separation between the mind and the body. I hold that people are immaterial souls capable of existing apart from and surviving the deaths of their physical bodies. Importantly, however, one does not need to accept this very strong sort of dualism in order to affirm the minimal tenets of substance dualism. For example, one need not believe that there are immortal souls or that minds are actually capable of surviving the death of the body. William Hasker, for example, has developed what he calls emergent dualism, where the immaterial mind emerges from the physical brain. As he explains, Cartesian dualism simply accepts the chasm, postulating the soul as an entity of a completely different nature than the physical, an entity with no essential or internal relationship to the body, which must be added to the body. In rejecting such dualisms, we implicitly affirm that the human mind is produced by the human brain and is not a separate element added to the brain from outside. This leads to the further conclusion that mental properties are emergent. Emergent dualism recognizes that a great many mental processes are irreducibly teleological and cannot be explained by or supervenient upon brain processes that have a complete mechanistic explanation. So the power attributed to matter by emergent dualism amounts to this. When suitably configured, it generates a field of consciousness that is able to function teleologically and to exercise libertarian free will, and the field of consciousness in turn modifies and directs the functioning of the physical brain. Thus, on Hasker's view, the mind is causally dependent upon the brain, but because it is still wholly distinct from the brain, Hasker's view is still a sort of substance dualism. I say all of that just to highlight the reality that there is a fair amount of diversity among dualists. What they hold in common is just the thesis that there is an immaterial mind distinct from the physical body. By itself, substance dualism makes no claims about the essential immortality of the soul or the possibility of its existing apart from the body. But for the purposes of this video, I wish to keep things as simple as possible, so we can broadly think of philosophy of mind as being split into these three different categories: physicalism, dualism, and idealism. Some of my viewers might be wondering about other categories, such as panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is fundamental and that all things have a proto-conscious or mind-like quality. These other perspectives are interesting, but won't be terribly relevant to the remainder of this series, which is intended to argue for substance dualism. As such, I have chosen not to give extensive consideration to some of the more fringe options in the debate over the nature of consciousness in this introductory video. With the advent of modern science, dualism was on the decline among academics for the majority of the 20th century. There was a hopeful optimism among intellectuals that advances in science would fully explain the mind in purely scientific terms, and that dualism was an outdated obstacle which stood in the way of this endeavor. Patricia Churchland expressed the basic sentiment this way: the concept of a non-physical soul looks increasingly like an outdated theoretical curiosity. Anthony Kenny was even harsher, saying, "I regard the inheritance of Descartes as being the single most substantial obstacle to a correct philosophical understanding of the nature of the human mind." But things have begun to shift. Although, as already observed, physicalism remains the majority position among philosophers, it has been challenged with increasing frequency and vigor. In recent years, an impressive series of publications have arrived on the scene from leading philosophers in the field, which are filled with a formidable array of impressive arguments for substance dualism. As Robert Koons and George Beeler say, over the last 50 years or so, materialism has been challenged by a daunting list of arguments, some inspired by classical arguments from the history of philosophy and others wholly new, beginning with the Chisholm-Geach-Putnam attack on behaviorism and fortified by Kripke's attack on the identity theory, followed by a host of others: the multiple realizability argument, the disembodiment argument, the certainty argument, the zombie or non-conscious automaton argument, the absent qualia argument, the knowledge argument, the inverted spectrum argument, the argument from the special sciences, the explanatory gap argument, the anti-individualism argument, the self-consciousness argument, the mental causation argument, and many, many more. Taken together, these arguments and sophisticated variations on them constitute a significant prima facie threat to the success of materialism. Even Kenny laments the revival of substance dualism, saying, "In the last 2 decades, there has been a surprising revival of Cartesianism. It is for this reason that I believe that it is, once again, worthwhile to attempt to destroy the Cartesian myth." This series will explore many of these recent arguments for dualism and defend them in detail. It is unfortunate that most of these arguments simply do not receive rigorous attention from contemporary physicalist philosophers who tend to see physicalism as a foregone conclusion. Arguments for dualism are seen as more of an annoyance than as a serious challenge. Andrea Lavazza and Howard Robinson suggest, "The present situation indicates that mental physical dualism has fallen into disfavor in the contemporary intellectual scene, not because the arguments for it have been found to be faulty, but because it is assumed not to fit or fit sufficiently well with the naturalist perspective that the advance of science had made seem so irresistible. One result of this has been a widespread failure to appreciate the force of those arguments." And Rickabaugh and Moreland add, "It is no exaggeration to say that substance dualism is undergoing an unforeseen revival and is poised to make a strong return in the 21st century. These reasons are not merely sociological reflections, but expressions of the rapid growth in sophisticated new work on substance dualism. A large number of recently published book-length defenses of substance dualism evidence this, along with collections of new pro-substance dualism papers. The number of journal articles defending substance dualism is too long to list. Conspicuous by their absence are substantive engagements with these works." But physicalists cannot simply ignore the arguments for substance dualism. There is no particularly good reason to simply assume that science will one day reveal that the mind can be understood in purely physical terms, and the arguments for dualism provide strong reasons to believe that science neither will do this nor even can do this. In this series, I intend to detail several of the best arguments for substance dualism in order to put pressure on physicalists to begin engaging substance dualism rather than to continue hand-waving it away as something which no one should take seriously. Much of the contemporary academic aversion to dualism comes from the religious implications which are often associated with it. The notion of a soul is often regarded as a distinctly religious notion. After all, belief in souls has played an important role in many of the major religions of the world by allowing for the possibility of an afterlife. As John Foster observes, "Many people in our own culture believe that human individuals continue to exist in a purely spiritual form after their biological death, and many in other cultures believe in reincarnation. These beliefs are hard to make intelligible without the assumption that the human individual himself is a purely spiritual entity, which is capable of existing apart from a body and capable of migrating from one body to another." But in an age which is becoming increasingly secular, dualism tends to be seen as an unscientific relic of the past, unbefitting of educated modern people. The only reason why anyone would embrace dualism, so the thinking goes, is due to their religious convictions. For example, the atheist philosopher John Searle forthrightly admits, "We have a terror of falling into Cartesian dualism. The bankruptcy of the Cartesian tradition and the absurdity of supposing that there are two kinds of substances or properties in the world, mental and physical, is so threatening to us, and has had such a sordid history, that we are reluctant to concede anything that might smack of Cartesianism. Similarly, the atheist Anthony Kenny says, when they say that human beings have souls, philosophers and theologians often mean something more than just that human beings have minds. They mean that human beings have immortal minds, minds which can survive the death of the bodies whose minds they are, minds which can live without bodies, at least for a period, and perhaps forever. This claim is supported sometimes by philosophical argument, sometimes by appeal to religious revelation, sometimes by alleging communication from those beyond the grave. While I do not doubt that religious beliefs play a role in why many people accept dualism, it must be remembered that dualism is not an inherently religious idea. It can be supported on religiously neutral, purely philosophical grounds, as I will attempt to show in future videos. Moreover, substance dualism is not logically incompatible with atheism. As atheist philosopher Evan Fales observes, a naturalist who is not sanguine about the reducibility of the mental to the physical has several options. These include token-token identity theories such as functionalism, property dualism, and, more daringly, substance dualism. It is useful to consider whether there is some minimal conception of metaphysical or ontological naturalism that captures, in a principled way, the minimal core beliefs bearing on the issue of atheism. A plausible proposal is that the naturalist is committed to the claim that there are no disembodied minds. This view is not incompatible with substance dualism, but requires that, if there are immaterial mental substances, they cannot be things that exist apart from embodiment in a physical substance. And interestingly enough, there are a number of prominent atheists and agnostics who actually defend substance dualism. These include names like C.D. Broad, Karl Popper, Lawrence Bonjour, Richard Fumerton, and Michael Huemer. This should make it clear that there are other motivations driving substance dualism besides just religious or superstitious beliefs. Nevertheless, although I have emphasized the fact that there is no strict logical incongruity between atheism and substance dualism, I still think that atheists have one strong reason to resist it. That reason being that the existence of immaterial minds is at the very least good evidence for theism, given that theism entails the existence of at least one immaterial mind, whereas atheism does not. Therefore, immaterial minds are less surprising on theism than atheism. As Rickabaugh and Moreland explain, the prior probability of conscious and intrinsically valuable beings is higher on theism than on atheism. Given theism, God would have several reasons for creating conscious and intrinsically valuable beings and bring about whatever conditions that would do the job. It seems likely that God would want to have love relationships with creatures, to share his knowledge and what it is like to experience various things with them. Being creative, God desires to create all kinds of beings, those like human persons, being one kind, and so on. But in atheistic hypotheses about the actual world, there is no such being who wants to bring about creatures like us. There is no teleological driving force behind the laws of nature that would be directed towards bringing about the conditions required for our coming to be. Rather, on atheist worlds with laws like ours, it is extremely unlikely that those conditions would obtain. And elsewhere, Moreland argues, robust positive naturalism is correctly seen as entailing strict physicalism, but its ontology is hard to defend. For this reason, versions of naturalism are formulated at other points along the spectrum, with those at the other end resting content to quantify over a large shopping list of sui generis, recalcitrant entities, or denigrating into the merely negative thesis that God does not exist. The increasing price to be paid for residents along the spectrum whose distance from robust positive naturalism widens is a growing loss of explanatory power and comportment with the ontology, epistemology, and methodology of the hard sciences. In short, the robust positive naturalist response to restrictive pressures retains, in principle, the potential for naturalist explanatory and epistemic superiority, but also renders it a distorted false picture of reality. Naturalist responses that seek to be more inclusive increasingly render naturalism less definite, more ad hoc and question-begging, and weaken its claim to explanatory or epistemic superiority. Thus, although the truth of substance dualism does not definitively disprove atheism or prove theism, the defense of it is worthwhile to the Christian apologist insofar as substance dualism provides evidence for theism. But the apologetic value of defending substance dualism does not end here, for many contemporary objections to theism rest on the alleged unintelligibility or low prior probability of the possibility of a disembodied mind. For example, Anthony Kenny argues against the intelligibility of God by arguing against the intelligibility of a disembodied mind, saying, instead of asking whether there is a personal God, we might ask whether there is a God who has a mind. But what is a mind? The human minds we know are embodied minds, material and finite, which develop over time, which inquire, learn, forget, and err. How can mentality be attributed to a being like the God of tradition, who is totally immaterial and non-bodily? Since God is supposed to be a disembodied mind, the unlikelihood of a disembodied mind correspondingly raises the evidential bar that the theist must meet in order to justify theism. Yet if substance dualism, which entails that minds are logically if not causally distinct from bodies, is true, then this renders the concept of a disembodied mind, and therefore of God, more plausible than it would otherwise be. Hence the apologetic significance of substance dualism is not restricted to theistic arguments from consciousness, but also has value for the apologetic endeavor more broadly. As Charles Taliaferro says, all the classical arguments employed to justify belief in God have been systematically attacked on the grounds that the concept of a non-physical personal God is incoherent. I have stressed the importance of the philosophy of mind for the philosophy of God, emphasizing the threat one poses for the other. I think there is no doubt about this threat, or any doubt that the radically materialist conception of reality threatens more than theistic religious beliefs. It also threatens ethics and our very self-image. Because much of this project and the questions raised about the nature of ourselves and God are foundational, I think philosophically prior to articulating the customary arguments for God's existence, there is a heavy emphasis on establishing the coherence and clarity of certain key tenets in a theistic vision of the cosmos. Without the coherence of these notions in place, we are handicapped in debating the classical arguments for theism. So to summarize, substance dualism is pertinent to Christian apologetics for at least 3 reasons. First, it is important for preserving and securing important Christian religious beliefs, such as that there is an afterlife. Second, although it does not disprove atheism, it supplies a valuable argument for God's existence. And third, it helps to render theism more credible by establishing both the possibility and plausibility of disembodied minds. For these reasons, Christian apologists cannot afford to neglect this area. Having introduced viewers to the 3 major camps within philosophy of mind, and having said something about the relevance of substance dualism to Christian apologetics, let me conclude this video by disambiguating some of the terms which will come up. In particular, I want to define what exactly I mean by a substance, and then detail some of the differences between physical and non-physical substances. This is important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, it will give viewers a clearer conception of what these terms mean when I begin arguing for substance dualism in future videos. Second, it will preemptively ward off a series of objections which physicalists often make against substance dualism, according to which there is no intelligible definition of a substance, or that there is no positive account of what it means for a substance to be immaterial. Third and finally, not only will clearly defining these categories preemptively answer a battery of physicalist objections to dualism, but it will also preemptively answer one of the primary idealist objections to both physicalism and dualism, according to which there is no intelligible account of what it means for a substance to be physical. We shall begin by defining what a substance is. Very roughly, a substance is a particular or a thing which is logically independent of other things and which has essential characteristics without which it could not exist. Stuart Goetz gives a good rough and ready definition, saying, "A substance is a particular entity or thing, whether material, like a table or a tree, or immaterial, like a soul, which has or exemplifies essential properties or characteristics that it cannot lose without ceasing to exist." Rickabaugh and Moreland give a more technically precise definition. X is a substance if and only if 1. X is an essentially characterized particular, 2. X has and is the principle of unity for its properties, but is not had by or predicable of something more basic than it, 3. X is an enduring continuant, 4. X has inseparable parts but is not composed of separable parts, 5. X is complete in species. The basic idea is just that something is a substance if one couldn't take away any of its characteristics without destroying its very existence. Having given some explanation of what a substance is supposed to be, we turn to an examination of what is meant by the terms physical or material and non-physical or immaterial. Given that the latter terms are dependent upon the former, we shall begin by analyzing what it is for an object to be physical or material. This task is not as easy as it might initially appear. It is easy to extend out relatively uncontroversial examples of physical objects, such as apples, trees, houses, dogs, and planets, but it is considerably harder to abstract from them an analysis of physical objects which includes all of the things which we would want to include within the category of the physical. So just what is a physical object? Well, one might be tempted to say that a physical object is an object which possesses physical properties, but such a definition is utterly circular and therefore unenlightening. As Sandra Menson and Thomas Sullivan observe, to maintain that a purely natural or scientific explanation has been so successful that we can all be confident the world is a physically closed system and inquiry into theism is fatuous, one should have a reasonably clear account of what it is for a thing to be physical. Of course, it cannot simply be said that a physical thing is a thing with physical properties, and that physical properties are properties of physical things. That would make no one any wiser. One might try to define the physical as anything that exists, but this too is uninformative. As Charles Taliaferro says, what are physical objects and properties? Obviously, it would not do at the outset to reply, whatever exists, for that alone would not tell us anything distinctive about the physical. It seems to me that the most promising account of a physical object, which will include most putative examples of physical objects, and which will not be utterly vacuous, will understand them in a broadly Cartesian way as objects which satisfy two basic conditions. First, they are extended in space. Second, they exist independently of anyone's awareness of them. David Lund agrees with this analysis, saying, "Though arriving at an entirely satisfactory understanding of what physicality is far from easy, it will be sufficient for our purposes to specify the conditions something must satisfy to be physical, namely some necessary conditions. Perhaps a genuinely intrinsic characterization is beyond our reach, but two necessary conditions or features that must be present are specifiable. Physical objects are extended in space and exist independently of our awareness of them. Because they have objective or independent existence, any epistemic access we might have to them would be a public access, i.e., they would be accessible, either directly or indirectly, to many observers from many points of view. We might say that they are publicly observable in virtue of our perceptual access to them, provided that we bear in mind that our sensory observation of them may be indirect rather than direct, or, in other words, that they may be only indirectly accessible to our sense organs. Obviously, like all other accounts, the Cartesian analysis is not without its detractors. Menson and Sullivan, for example, aren't impressed with this account of the physical, objecting that, nor can it be said that physical properties are properties that endow their bearers with extension in space and time. It has been a long while since physicists have embraced a Cartesian view that ties physical things to extension. Point-like objects without substructure are now acceptable as physical entities. However, Menson and Sullivan are attributing to Descartes a needlessly narrow conception of extension in space. As Taliaferro responds, it has been objected that straightforward physical things, such as objects with zero rest mass and fields, lack spatial extension. If points exist, then they lack volume and shape, but they do not thereby lack location. Provided we understand Descartes' analysis so that spatial location suffices to secure spatial extension, his analysis of physicality still seems acceptable. Fields and points, if there are points, have location, even if the location of the former lacks well-defined boundaries in terms of areas of operation, and the latter are virtually observable by us. So Descartes' reading of what it is to be physical seems safe over against these problems, as long as we do not assume that spatial extension must be voluminous and spatial objects must possess clearly demarcated surfaces. While there may not be any uncontroversial conceptual analysis of physical objects, which will be acceptable to everyone, or will include every putative example, the Cartesian analogous suggested here has the merit of being substantive, non-circular, illuminating, and at the very least is not susceptible to any obvious counterexamples. Furthermore, the sorts of counterexamples which critics might attempt to raise for it need not concern us in the context of the mind-body problem, since it is my purpose to argue for the truth of substance dualism over and against physicalism, and the candidate explanations for the mind which physicalists put forth meet the criteria I have set forth for something being physical. As such, this analysis suffices for the purposes of this video series. So having offered an analysis of what it is for something to be physical or material, we are now better positioned to understand what it means for something to be non-physical or immaterial. At a first pass, given the understanding of being physical which I have stipulated, it is rather easy to characterize an immaterial substance. It is just a substance which is not material. One can simply invert the aforementioned conditions for an object being physical. In other words, something is immaterial just in case it is not extended in space and does not exist independently of anyone's awareness of it. Unfortunately, things are not so easy. As stated, this is a purely negative analysis of what it is for something to be non-physical, and this begins to look suspiciously like describing something which does not exist at all. Lund expresses the worry as follows. A more serious challenge to the notion of a mental self, conceived as a non-physical substance, is the charge that the notion of a mental self can be explicated only in terms of negative characteristics such as having no spatial location or extension and being devoid of all intrinsic physical properties. The challenge, then, is to identify some positive characteristic that is intrinsic and essential to the existence of the subject. One way to meet this challenge is by attempting to recast the denial of the conditions for being a physical object in a positive way. This is much easier in the case of the second condition. We can, for example, say that the existence of an immaterial entity is awareness dependent. Alternatively, we could say that it is essentially private, only directly accessible by a single individual. It's a little more difficult to assert the denial of the first condition for being a physical object in a positive way, but here is one attempt. We can say that an immaterial entity can possibly be multiply instantiated, rather than that it merely lacks spatial extension. Different minds can have the same or corresponding thoughts, for example. In this way, we can say something positive about immaterial entities. Importantly, these conditions, as they apply to immaterial entities, are best read as sufficient conditions, but not as necessary conditions. This is because something like abstract objects, if they exist, would be immaterial, but they would only meet the first of these conditions. Rickabaugh and Moreland attempt to give a precise understanding of what it is for a self to be immaterial. They define it as follows. An immaterial self or soul is 1. A substance, 2. Has no separable parts, 3. Metaphysically indivisible in being, though it may be fractured in functioning, 4. Not spatially extended, though some characterizations hold that it may be spatially located, 5. Essentially characterized by the actual and potential properties of consciousness. David Lund builds on this final point by suggesting that the capacity for consciousness is a positive characteristic of an immaterial substance. As he explains, the capacity for consciousness arguably is present throughout the existence of the subject. It seems undeniable that the subject ceases to exist at the moment one becomes irreversibly or permanently unconscious. What could it be for a subject of conscious states to exist beyond that moment? Such a capacity would have to be basic in that its ground lies in what is most fundamental to the subject and to the natural laws bearing upon it. But the notion of a basic capacity seems unproblematic. The basic capacity to move, possessed by every physical thing, seems to be possessed not in virtue of any structural characteristics of the thing, but simply in virtue of it being a spatial substance. Similarly, it may be that a subject possesses a basic capacity for consciousness simply in virtue of its being a non-spatial substance. The capacity for consciousness is a positive intrinsic characteristic apparently essential to the existence of the subject. Perhaps a physicalist will object to Lund's suggestion by claiming that it is question-begging. They might claim that he is assuming that consciousness is non-physical, or that the sorts of things which have the capacity for consciousness are non-physical. Now, this certainly would be question-begging if Lund or myself were trying to use the proposition that the capacity for consciousness can only be possessed by immaterial substances as an argument against physicalism. But in the present context, that's not what we're doing. We're attempting to give a positive analysis of what it is for something to be immaterial. And just as when giving an analysis of what it was for something to be physical, it is perfectly legitimate for the dualist to begin by extending out examples of the types of things he takes to be non-physical. And from there, he can abstract a positive statement of what he takes non-physical entities to be. One might just as easily object to the analysis I gave earlier of physical objects by objecting that I have assumed from the start that things like apples and houses are physical objects. There is nothing wrong with taking paradigm cases of what one takes to be physical objects to abstract a positive description of what it is for something to be physical. For the same reason, there is nothing wrong with taking paradigm cases of what one takes to be immaterial objects to abstract a positive description of what it is for something to be immaterial. That's just how abstraction works. This video has laid the groundwork for future arguments for substance dualism. I have briefly surveyed the major options in the philosophy of mind, physicalism, idealism, and dualism. I have explained that, despite much prejudice against it, substance dualism is currently growing in popularity. I have shown that this debate is relevant to Christian apologetics for a number of reasons. And lastly, I have done some work to define several of the critical terms which will come into play throughout this series. I have defined the notion of a substance, I have offered and briefly defended an account of physical substance, and I have offered and briefly defended an account of immaterial substance. My hope is that this video serves to equip viewers with the necessary background information to understand the subsequent videos in this series, as well as to grasp the importance of the mind-body problem for Christian apologetics.